Blood trickled down Sarah Reynolds' face as she crawled through the underbrush, each movement sending waves of agony through her swollen abdomen. The baby inside her kicked frantically, as if sensing its mother's desperation on this cold Montana night in 1876. She had been left for dead by the man who had once promised her the world, and now the wilderness would be her grave unless a miracle happened. The forest floor was damp beneath her palms as she dragged herself forward, her once fine blue dress now torn and stained with dirt and blood. The wound on her temple throbbed in time with her heartbeat, and the pain in her abdomen intensified with each passing minute. Sarah knew the baby was coming, and coming soon. A sob escaped her lips as another contraction gripped her, stronger than the last. "Please," she whispered to the star-scattered sky visible through the pine branches. "Please don't let my baby die out here." Miles away, Daniel Foster guided his horse along the forest trail, returning to his cabin after a long day of tracking a mountain lion that had been preying on local livestock. The moon hung high and bright, illuminating the path before him. His weathered face, tanned from years under the western sun, was tired but alert. At 32, Daniel had spent most of his adult life in these mountains, preferring solitude to the chaos of town life. His horse, Thunder, suddenly stopped and raised its head, ears pricked forward. "What is it, boy?" Daniel murmured, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. Years of survival in the wilderness had taught him to trust his horse's instincts. Thunder snorted and pawed at the ground, refusing to move forward. Daniel dismounted, keeping his hand near his weapon as he scanned the darkness. The forest was unnaturally quiet, save for the distant call of an owl. He took a few cautious steps forward, then froze when he heard a faint moan coming from the brush to his right. Drawing his revolver, Daniel approached slowly. "Who's there?" he called out, his deep voice cutting through the night air. The only response was another pained moan, weaker than the first. Daniel pushed aside the branches of a young pine and found himself looking down at the crumpled form of a woman, her face pale in the moonlight, her dress soaked with blood at the hem. "My God," he breathed, holstering his weapon and kneeling beside her. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing frightened blue eyes. Daniel's gaze moved to her swollen belly and understanding dawned. "You're with child." Sarah flinched away from him, terror evident in her bloodshot eyes. Don't hurt us," she pleaded, one hand protectively covering her abdomen. Daniel raised his hands slowly, showing he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you, madam. I want to help." His voice was gentle, a stark contrast to his rugged appearance. "My cabin's not far from here. You need shelter and medical attention." Another contraction seized Sarah and she cried out, curling into herself. Daniel knew there wasn't much time. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his leather coat and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. Then, with the utmost care, he lifted her into his arms. Sarah whimpered but didn't resist. She was too weak, too close to giving up. As Daniel carried her toward Thunder, he leaned down and whispered, "You're safe. I promise you're safe now." Sarah's eyes met his, and for the first time since she'd been abandoned in these woods, she felt a flicker of hope. Daniel managed to get Sarah onto his horse, mounting behind her to keep her secure. She leaned back against his chest, semi-conscious and burning with fever. He could feel the irregular contractions of her abdomen against his arm as he held her steady. "Stay with me," he urged as Thunder picked his way carefully through the forest. "My cabin's just beyond that ridge, not much longer now." Sarah nodded weakly, her breathing shallow. "My baby," she whispered. "Please save my baby." "I'll do everything I can," Daniel promised, though anxiety churned in his stomach. He had basic medical knowledge from his years as a ranch hand and his time served in the cavalry during the war, but delivering a baby was beyond his experience. Still, he knew that if he didn't try, both mother and child would die in these woods tonight. The cabin appeared in the clearing ahead, a sturdy structure Daniel had built with his own hands 5 years ago after leaving behind the chaotic life of a cowboy. A thin wisp of smoke still curled from the chimney, the remnants of the fire he'd lit that morning. Daniel dismounted quickly and lifted Sarah from the saddle. "Almost there," he assured her as he carried her to the cabin door. He managed to push it open with his boot and hurried inside, laying her gently on his bed. The cabin was simple but clean: one main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a bed pushed against the far wall. Shelves lined with books, preserved foods, and medical supplies occupied another wall. It wasn't much, but it had been enough for Daniel these past years. He stoked the dying embers in the fireplace and added fresh logs, needing heat and light. Sarah moaned again, louder this time, her hands gripping the rough woolen blanket beneath her. "The baby's coming," she gasped, panic evident in her voice. Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll help you through this." He moved to the shelves and grabbed clean cloths, his medical kit, and a bottle of whiskey. Then he filled a basin with water from the barrel by the door and placed it all on the small table beside the bed. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep her focused as he assessed her condition. "Sarah," she replied between panted breaths. "Sarah Reynolds. I'm Daniel Foster. Most folks around these parts call me Dan." He offered her a reassuring smile as he dampened a cloth and gently cleaned the wound on her temple. "This cut isn't too deep, but you've lost blood." "Can you tell me what happened to you, Sarah?" She winced as he dabbed at the wound. "My husband, he's not." Her voice broke. "We weren't legally married. He brought me west from Boston, promised me a life together, a home for our child." Tears streamed down her dirty cheeks. "When we reached Montana territory, he changed, started drinking, gambling. When he found out I was with child, She paused, another contraction seizing her. Daniel waited patiently until it passed. "Take your time." He said the baby wasn't his, accused me of. Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. "He brought me into these woods, said he was taking a shortcut to Helena, then he hit me, pushed me down a slope, left me to die." Rage flooded through Daniel at the thought of a man abandoning a pregnant woman in the wilderness. "What's his name?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Victor Blackwood," she whispered, and then cried out as another contraction hit, stronger than before. Daniel set aside his questions and focused on the immediate crisis. "The baby's coming now, isn't it?" Sarah nodded, her face contorted with pain. "It's too early," she gasped. "It shouldn't come for another month." "Sometimes babies have their own ideas about timing," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice calm despite his mounting anxiety. He'd helped birth countless calves and foals in his ranching days, but never a human child. Still, the principles couldn't be that different, he reasoned. He helped Sarah out of her ruined dress and positioned her as comfortably as possible on the bed, preserving her modesty with a clean sheet while still allowing him to assist with the birth. He washed his hands thoroughly in the basin, then poured some whiskey over them for good measure. "I'm going to check how close the baby is," he explained, his voice steady despite his nervousness. Sarah nodded, too exhausted and in too much pain to feel embarrassment. The next few hours were a blur of pain and effort for Sarah and focused determination for Daniel. He talked her through each contraction, wiped her brow with cool cloths, and encouraged her when she felt she couldn't continue. "You're doing wonderfully," he assured her as dawn began to lighten the sky outside the cabin windows. "I can see the baby's head now, just a few more pushes." Sarah summoned her last reserves of strength, gripping Daniel's offered hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. With a final, tremendous effort and a cry that seemed to echo through the small cabin, she pushed her baby into the world. The infant's wail, strong and indignant, filled the room. Daniel quickly tied off and cut the cord, then wrapped the tiny, squirming bundle in a clean cloth. "You have a daughter," he told Sarah, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the baby in her trembling arms. "A perfect little girl." Sarah stared down at her daughter's face in wonder, tears streaming down her cheeks. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when she briefly opened her eyes, they were the deep blue of all newborns. "She's so beautiful," Sarah whispered, touching a finger to her daughter's tiny hand. The baby instinctively grasped it, her grip surprisingly strong for one so small. "Thank you, Daniel. You saved us both." Daniel smiled, watching the pair with a strange tightness in his chest. "You did all the hard work, I just helped a little." As he cleaned up and tended to Sarah's remaining needs, Daniel found himself thinking that his solitary cabin had never felt so full of life as it did now, with this exhausted mother and her newborn child. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's life transformed entirely. His cabin, once a solitary sanctuary, now housed 3 souls. Sarah regained her strength gradually, moving from bed rest to cautious movements around the cabin, always with her daughter, whom she named Hope, cradled against her chest. Daniel found himself riding into the nearest town, Riverspend, more often than he had in years. He purchased baby clothes, additional blankets, and foods that would help Sarah regain her strength. Each time he returned, the sight of Sarah's grateful smile made the long ride worthwhile. "You've done so much for us already," Sarah protested one evening as Daniel arrived with yet another bundle of supplies. Hope, now 3 weeks old, slept peacefully in a cradle he had crafted from pine boards during the long evenings. "It's nothing," Daniel insisted, setting down his packages on the table. "Besides, it gives me an excuse to go to town and hear all the gossip." His attempt at levity didn't quite mask the seriousness in his eyes. Every trip to town was also an opportunity to ask discreet questions about Victor Blackwood. So far, he'd learned that Blackwood had indeed passed through Riverspend about a month ago, traveling with a wife who matched Sarah's description. The bartender at the Silver Dollar Saloon remembered him losing heavily at cards for several nights running, then suddenly having money again before heading north. No one had seen him since. Sarah seemed to read his thoughts, any word of him. She asked quietly, adjusting the blanket around Hope's tiny form. Daniel shook his head. "Nothing recent. Seems he headed toward the Canadian border. Sheriff Wilson says if he crossed, he's out of their jurisdiction." Relief and disappointment warred on Sarah's face. "I don't want revenge," she said softly. "I just want to be sure he never finds us." "He won't," Daniel promised. The protective instinct he felt toward Sarah and Hope surprised him with its intensity. In just a few short weeks, they had become more important to him than anything else in his life. As May turned to June, the mountains around the cabin exploded with wildflowers and new growth. Sarah grew stronger daily, and Hope thrived under their combined care. Daniel found himself enchanted by the infant's developing personality, her serious expressions when studying his face, her delighted coos when he sang old trail songs to her. One warm afternoon, Daniel returned from checking his trap lines to find Sarah sitting on the bench he'd built outside the cabin. Hope was asleep in her arms, and Sarah's face was turned toward the sun, eyes closed. He stopped for a moment, struck by the picture they made, Sarah's copper gold hair shining in the sunlight, her skin losing the pallor of illness and taking on a healthy glow. She was beautiful, he realized, not for the first time, enjoying the sunshine. He asked, approaching with his catch 2 rabbits that would make a good stew. Sarah opened her eyes and smiled. "It feels wonderful after being inside for so long. Hope seems to like it too. She fell asleep as soon as we sat down." Daniel settled beside her on the bench, careful not to wake the baby. "You both look well. The mountain air agrees with you." "It does." Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "Daniel, I've been thinking, we can't impose on you forever." His heart sank unexpectedly at her words. "You're not imposing. We've taken over your home, your bed. I'm perfectly comfortable on my bedroll," he interrupted. "And your life," she finished. "You're a bachelor who suddenly finds himself with a woman and infant in his home. It can't be what you wanted." Daniel was silent for a long moment, considering his next words carefully. "Before I found you in those woods, my life was empty, full of routine, but empty of purpose beyond survival." He glanced at Hope's sleeping face, then met Sarah's eyes. "Having you both here has given me something I didn't know I was missing." Sarah's cheeks flushed pink. "Even so, I need to make plans. I have some skills I can sew. I was trained as a school teacher in Boston, perhaps in Riverspend." "The town's too small for a proper school," Daniel said, perhaps too quickly. "But if you're determined to leave, Helena might offer opportunities." The thought of them leaving filled him with dread, though he tried not to show it. He had no claim on Sarah or her child, no right to ask them to stay. "I'm not determined to leave," Sarah said quietly. "I just don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Daniel assured her firmly. "Stay as long as you want, at least until Hope is a bit older and you're fully recovered." He hesitated, then added, "I've grown quite fond of having you both here." The simple admission hung in the air between them, more significant than it sounded. Sarah's eyes met his, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to name. "Then we'll stay," she said finally. For now, Daniel nodded, satisfaction warming his chest. For now was enough for the present. Tomorrow would take care of itself. As summer progressed, Daniel and Sarah fell into a comfortable routine. He handled the hunting, trapping, and heavier chores around the cabin while she cooked, tended to Hope, and gradually took over the vegetable garden he had started years ago but never quite mastered. Under Sarah's care, the garden flourished, producing more vegetables than Daniel had ever managed to grow. He built her a small chicken coop and brought back 6 hens from town, providing them with fresh eggs. Their meals together became highlights of his days, not just for the improved food, but for the companionship. In the evenings, after Hope was asleep, they would sit by the fire. Sometimes Daniel would read aloud from one of his books. He had quite a collection for a mountain man, Sarah noted with surprise early on. Other times, they would simply talk, sharing pieces of their pasts. Daniel told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, losing his parents to influenza when he was 17, joining a cattle drive west to start a new life, and eventually fighting briefly in the latter days of the Civil War before finding peace in the mountains of Montana Territory. Sarah shared stories of her childhood in Boston, her strict but loving parents, her training as a teacher, and her fateful meeting with Victor Blackwood at a society function. He had been charming, worldly, promising adventure and romance, everything that her structured life had lacked. "I was such a fool," she said one evening, staring into the flames. "I believed everything he told me when he suggested we travel west together, claiming we were already married to preserve my reputation. I thought it romantic. My parents had passed on. I had no close family to object. I gave up everything to follow him." "You weren't a fool," Daniel said firmly. "You were trusting. There's a difference." "I trusted the wrong man." Daniel hesitated, then reached across to take her hand. "Not all men are like Blackwood." Sarah's fingers tightened around his. "I know that now." The touch of her hand and his sent warmth spreading through Daniel's chest. He had been attracted to Sarah from the beginning, admiring her strength, her intelligence, her devotion to her daughter. But somewhere along the way, attraction had deepened into something more profound. He was falling in love with her, he realized, and the knowledge both elated and terrified him. Did she feel the same? Sometimes he caught her watching him when she thought he wouldn't notice, her eyes soft with an emotion he dared not name. Other times, she seemed to maintain a careful distance, as if reminding herself that their arrangement was temporary. For now, Daniel was content to wait, to let whatever was growing between them develop naturally. Sarah had been through too much trauma to rush into another relationship, and he respected that. July brought intense heat to the mountains. Daniel spent more time near the creek that ran behind his property, occasionally fishing for their dinner. One particularly sweltering afternoon, he returned to the cabin to find it empty. Panic seized him momentarily until he spotted the note on the table. "At the creek with Hope. Needed to cool down." He found them in the small clearing by the creek where he often fished. Sarah sat on a flat rock at the water's edge, her skirts hiked modestly to her knees as she dangled her feet in the cool water. Hope lay on a blanket in the shade nearby, cooing at the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. Daniel paused at the edge of the trees, taking in the peaceful scene. Sarah had her eyes closed, face tilted toward the breeze coming off the water. Her copper hair was loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual practical bun, and the sight of it shining in the sunlight made his breath catch. Hope spotted him first, her little legs kicking excitedly as she recognized him. Her happy gurgle alerted Sarah, who turned and smiled when she saw him. "We couldn't stand the heat in the cabin another minute," she explained as Daniel approached. "Hope seems much happier out here." Daniel set down his fishing gear and knelt beside the blanket, letting Hope grasp his finger in her tiny fist. "Smart girl," he told the baby, who rewarded him with a toothless grin. "And a smart mama too. This is the coolest spot on the property on days like this. I hope you don't mind us claiming your fishing spot." "Not at all." Daniel settled on the grass near them. In fact, I think we should make this a regular occurrence, maybe even have our supper out here this evening. Sarah's face lit up at the suggestion. A picnic. I haven't had one since I was a girl. Then it's decided. Daniel gestured to his fishing pole. I'll even provide the main course if the trout are biting today. They spent the rest of the afternoon by the creek, with Daniel fishing while Sarah told hope stories and collected wildflowers. When he had caught 3 good-sized trout, Sarah returned to the cabin to prepare the rest of their meal while he cleaned the fish. That evening, they spread a blanket on the grassy bank and enjoyed their impromptu picnic as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Hope lay on the blanket between them, entranced by the changing colors of the sky. "This is perfect," Sarah said softly as they finished their meal. "Thank you for suggesting it." Daniel smiled, watching the last rays of sunlight play across her features. "We should do this more often. Maybe make it a tradition." "A tradition," Sarah repeated, and something in her tone made Daniel look at her more closely. She was staring out at the creek, her expression pensive. "What's wrong?" he asked. She sighed. "Nothing's wrong, it's just traditions imply permanence and I'm not sure." "Not sure if you'll stay," Daniel finished for her. Sarah nodded, finally meeting his eyes. "I've been thinking about it more lately. Hope is almost 3 months old now. I'm completely recovered. I should be making plans for our future." Daniel's heart constricted at the thought of them leaving, but he kept his voice steady. "What kind of future do you want, Sarah?" "A stable one, a safe one, somewhere Hope can grow up happy and loved." She looked down at her daughter, who had drifted off to sleep, one tiny hand curled against her cheek. "I want her to have everything I lost when I made the mistake of trusting Victor." "You can have that here," Daniel said before he could stop himself. "Both of you." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "Daniel, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he hastened to add. "I'm just saying there's a place for you here for as long as you want it. No obligations, no expectations." "That's not fair to you," she protested gently. "Let me worry about what's fair to me." Daniel reached across the sleeping baby to take Sarah's hand. "All I know is that the thought of you leaving." He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah's fingers tightened around his. "I don't want to leave," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of trusting my judgment again, of making another mistake, of—" She hesitated, then continued, "of these feelings I have for you and whether they're real or just gratitude because you saved us." Daniel's heart raced at her admission. "What feelings?" he asked, needing to hear her say it. Sarah met his gaze, vulnerability and courage warring in her expression. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said simply. "And it terrifies me." The world seemed to stop for Daniel in that moment. The rushing of the creek, the chirping of evening birds, even the soft breathing of the sleeping baby between them all faded into the background as Sarah's words echoed in his mind. "It terrifies me too," he admitted. "I haven't let myself care for anyone like this ever." He squeezed her hand gently. "But I know what I feel for you isn't going away, and I'm willing to wait however long it takes for you to be sure of your feelings." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. "You're a good man, Daniel Foster." "I try to be," he said simply. "Especially for you and Hope." As twilight deepened around them, they sat in comfortable silence, hands still joined across the sleeping infant between them. Nothing had been resolved, yet everything had changed. They had acknowledged feelings that had been growing for months, opened a door that could not be closed again. For Daniel, it was enough for now. Sarah and Hope were still here, and she had admitted to feelings for him. The future, uncertain as it might be, suddenly seemed full of possibility. The first whispers of autumn touched the mountains as August faded into September. Nights grew cooler, and the aspen trees began to turn golden on the higher slopes. Daniel spent more time hunting, preparing meat to be smoked and preserved for the coming winter. One clear morning, as he prepared to leave for a 2-day hunting trip, Sarah watched him pack with obvious anxiety. "You'll be careful?" she asked, adjusting Hope on her hip. The baby, now 4 months old, was alert and curious, her eyes, which had darkened to a rich brown, following Daniel's movements with interest. "Always am," he assured her, checking his rifle one last time. "I won't go far, just to the North Ridge where I've seen elk signs. Should be back tomorrow evening, weather permitting." Sarah nodded, but her worried expression remained. "We'll be fine here. I know how to use the shotgun if needed." Daniel smiled at her determination. In the months she'd lived with him, Sarah had insisted on learning practical wilderness skills: how to shoot, how to recognize animal tracks, which plants were edible and which were poisonous. She was no longer the city woman who had arrived in his life half dead. She had adapted to mountain living with remarkable resilience. "I know you'll be fine," he said. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met." A blush colored her cheeks at his praise. "Go on with you," she said, but she was smiling now. "The sooner you leave, the sooner you'll be back." Daniel hesitated, then stepped closer. This would be the first time he had left them overnight since finding Sarah in the woods. On impulse, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, then one to Hope's downy head. "Take care of your mama," he told the baby seriously, and was rewarded with one of her infectious smiles. Sarah's eyes were bright when he straightened. "We'll be right here waiting when you return," she promised. With that assurance warming his heart, Daniel set off into the forest, following game trails he knew well. The day was perfect for hunting, cool and clear, with just enough breeze to carry his scent away from the game he tracked. By mid-afternoon, he had spotted a small herd of elk, including a young bull that would provide meat for most of the winter if properly preserved. He settled in to wait for the perfect shot, his mind drifting occasionally to the cabin and its occupants. The domestic scene he had left behind that morning felt right in a way nothing else in his life ever had. Sarah standing in the doorway with Hope in her arms, the smell of coffee and biscuits lingering in the air, the knowledge that they would be there when he returned it, gave his solitary existence new meaning. He wanted it to be permanent. The thought had been growing in his mind for weeks now. Since their conversation by the creek, he and Sarah had grown closer, sharing more frequent touches, occasional kisses tentative at first, then more confident. But they had not discussed the future again, both seemingly content to let their relationship develop naturally. Now, as Daniel lined up his shot on the elk, he found himself thinking of rings and promises, of making their unusual family official. Would Sarah be ready for such a step? Did she still harbor doubts about her feelings, fear that she was repeating past mistakes? The elk raised its head suddenly, alert to some distant sound. Daniel pushed his thoughts aside and focused, squeezing the trigger at precisely the right moment. The shot echoed through the valley and the elk dropped cleanly. It took him the rest of the day to dress and quarter the animal, hanging most of the meat in a tree to retrieve the next day. He kept enough for his dinner and made camp as darkness fell, building a small fire and settling in for the night. As he stared into the flames, Daniel's thoughts returned to Sarah and Hope, and the decision he had made while tracking the elk. When he returned to the cabin, he would ask Sarah to marry him. Not out of obligation or practicality, but because he loved her and wanted to build a life with her and Hope. He fell asleep under the stars, his mind full of plans for their future together. The next morning, Daniel woke before dawn, eager to collect the remaining meat and return home. He worked efficiently, loading his packhorse with the wrapped elk quarters, and began the journey back to the cabin by mid-morning. As he rounded the final bend in the trail that led to his property, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. Something was wrong. The cabin looked undisturbed from this distance, but an unnatural silence hung over the clearing. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cool day, and the chickens that should have been scratching in the yard were nowhere to be seen. Daniel drew his rifle from its scabbard and approached cautiously, every sense alert for danger. As he neared the cabin, he noticed the door standing slightly ajar. Sarah never left it open, especially with the cooler weather. His heart pounding, Daniel dismounted and moved silently toward the cabin, rifle at the ready. He pushed the door open slowly with the barrel of his gun. "Sarah," he called softly, then louder when no response came. "Sarah, Hope." The cabin was empty, but signs of a disturbance were everywhere. A chair was overturned, a cup lay broken on the floor, and most telling of all, Hope's cradle was empty, her blanket trailing over the side as if she had been grabbed hastily. Cold fear gripped Daniel's heart. He forced himself to breathe, to think logically. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no indication of a struggle beyond the minor disarray. Whatever had happened, Sarah and Hope had likely been taken alive. He moved back outside, scanning the ground for tracks. Their boot prints larger than Sarah's small footprints, heading away from the cabin toward the main trail. And hoofprints from at least 2 horses, one set deeper than the other as if bearing more weight. Daniel's mind raced. Who would take Sarah and Hope? The answer came to him in a flash of understanding: Victor Blackwood. The timing was too coincidental. Somehow the man must have learned where Sarah was, perhaps from gossip in Riverspend. With renewed urgency, Daniel returned to his horses. He quickly unloaded the elk meat, storing it in the root cellar beneath the cabin. Then he gathered supplies for pursuit: ammunition, food, water, medical supplies. Within 20 minutes, he was following the trail left by the kidnappers, his face set in grim determination. The tracks led west, toward the territorial border. Daniel pushed Thunder hard, alternating between a canter and a trot to maintain the horse's stamina. From the tracks, he guessed the kidnappers were no more than 5 or 6 hours ahead of him. If they were traveling with an infant, they would need to stop frequently. As dusk approached, Daniel spotted smoke rising from a small copse of trees ahead. He dismounted and approached on foot, moving silently through the underbrush until he could see the campsite. His breath caught in his throat. Sarah sat on a fallen log, Hope clutched tightly to her chest. Across from her, tending a small fire, was a man Daniel had never seen but instantly recognized from Sarah's descriptions: Victor Blackwood. Tall and lean, with dark hair and a carefully trimmed mustache, he had the appearance of a gentleman despite his travel-worn clothes. A second man, burlier and rougher looking, stood guard nearby, a rifle in his hands. Daniel assessed the situation quickly. He was outnumbered, and a direct confrontation risked Sarah and Hope getting caught in the crossfire. He retreated silently to where he had left Thunder, then circled the camp at a distance, looking for an approach that would give him the advantage. As he moved, he could hear voices carrying on the evening air. "Wasting my time with these ridiculous accusations," Sarah was saying, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "The child isn't yours, Victor. You made your opinion on that matter quite clear when you left me to die." "Perhaps I was hasty," came a smooth male voice. "Blackwood, undoubtedly. After reflection, I realize the timing makes it entirely possible the child is mine, and if so, she represents a significant investment. Sarah's voice rose incredulously. "She's a baby, not a mining claim." "Oh, but she's much more valuable than any mine, my dear. You see, my financial situation has become rather precarious of late. But a man with a motherless infant daughter can inspire remarkable generosity from wealthy widows seeking a ready-made family." Daniel's blood ran cold at the callousness of Blackwood's plan. The man intended to use Hope as a prop to swindle lonely women. "You're despicable," Sarah spat, "and you're wrong if you think I'll let you take her." "You don't have much choice in the matter," Blackwood replied, his tone hardening. "Tomorrow we cross into Idaho territory where no one knows us. From there, we'll head to California. You, my dear, will be left behind long before then. Perhaps I'll be kinder this time and leave you in a town rather than the wilderness." Daniel had heard enough. He needed to act before they moved Sarah and Hope further away. He noted the positions of both men and formulated a plan. Darkness had fallen completely now, the camp illuminated only by firelight. Daniel moved to a position behind the burly guard, drawing his hunting knife. In one swift motion, he emerged from the shadows, clamped a hand over the man's mouth, and pressed the knife to his throat. "Drop the rifle," he whispered harshly. "Make a sound and it'll be your last." The guard stiffened, then slowly lowered his weapon to the ground. Daniel kicked it away, then used the man's own bandana to gag him and his belt to bind his hands behind his back. With the guard secured, he returned to the edge of the clearing, preparing to confront Blackwood. Sarah was arguing with Blackwood, keeping his attention focused on her rather than his surroundings. "Hope needs me. She's still nursing. She'll die without proper care." "There are wet nurses to be found in any town," Blackwood dismissed her concern with a wave of his hand. "The child will survive the journey, and that's all that matters." "And if she doesn't?" Sarah challenged. "What happens to your plans then?" Blackwood's face darkened. You'd best hope she does survive for your sake. Daniel had seen and heard enough. He stepped into the clearing, his rifle aimed squarely at Blackwood's chest. I suggest you step away from them, he said, his voice deadly calm. Blackwood whirled around, reaching instinctively for the pistol at his hip. Daniel cocked his rifle, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. I wouldn't, he warned, not unless you want to die here tonight. Blackwood's hand froze, then slowly moved away from his weapon. His eyes darted around the campsite. Where's Jenkins? Your friend is indisposed, Daniel said flatly. Now move away from Sarah and the baby. Sarah's face had transformed at the sight of Daniel, fear giving way to relief and hope. She clutched Hope tighter, the baby remarkably quiet as if sensing the tension in the air. Blackwood's expression shifted from shock to calculation. You must be the mountain man I've heard so much about in town, the one who's been playing house with my wife and child. She's not your wife, Daniel said evenly, and after what you did, you have no claim to either of them. A smirk crossed Blackwood's face. The law might see things differently. A woman traveling with a man she's not married to, claiming a false abandonment, there was nothing false about it, Sarah interjected. You left me to die, your word against mine, my dear. Blackwood's smirk widened. And I can be very convincing when necessary. Just ask the sheriff in Riverspend, who was quite sympathetic to my story of a wife who ran off with another man while I was away on business. Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. It would be so easy to end this man's threats permanently. But he wasn't a murderer, and killing Blackwood would only create more problems. Sarah, he said, not taking his eyes off Blackwood, take Hope and go to my horse. He's tethered just beyond those pines. Sarah stood, moving cautiously around Blackwood toward Daniel. As she passed, Blackwood suddenly lunged, grabbing her arm and yanking her back against him. In the same motion, he drew his pistol and pressed it to her temple. Drop your rifle, he ordered Daniel, or I'll finish what I started in the woods. Hope began to cry, frightened by the sudden movement and tension. Sarah's face was pale with fear, but her eyes met Daniel's with a silent message. Don't give in. Daniel knew he couldn't risk a shot with Sarah and Hope so close to Blackwood. Slowly, he lowered his rifle to the ground. That's better, Blackwood said, his confidence returning. Now, whatever he planned to say next was cut off as Sarah suddenly drove her elbow hard into his stomach. The unexpected blow caused him to double over, his grip on her loosening. Sarah tore away from him, clutching Hope protectively as she ran toward Daniel. Blackwood recovered quickly, raising his pistol again, but Daniel was faster. He dove for his rifle, rolled, and came up firing in one fluid motion. The shot caught Blackwood in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying. Blackwood howled in pain, clutching his bleeding shoulder as he staggered backward. Daniel advanced on him, rifle aimed and ready for another shot if needed. It's over, he told Blackwood. You've lost. The wounded man glared at him with pure hatred. This isn't over, he spat. The child is mine. I'll go to every court in the territory if I have to. You'll do no such thing, came Sarah's voice, suddenly steel hard. She had retrieved Blackwood's fallen pistol and now held it steadily aimed at him. Because if you ever come near Hope or me again, I'll kill you myself. The absolute conviction in her voice seemed to finally penetrate Blackwood's arrogance. He looked from Sarah to Daniel and back, realizing he was facing two people who would do anything to protect the child and each other. Get on your horse and ride, Daniel ordered him. Don't stop until you're out of Montana territory. If I ever see you again, I won't aim for your shoulder. For a moment it seemed Blackwood might argue further, then clutching his wounded shoulder, he backed toward his horse. This isn't over, he said again, but the threat sounded hollow now. Yes, it is, Sarah replied firmly. Goodbye, Victor. They watched as Blackwood mounted awkwardly and rode away into the darkness. Only when he was completely out of sight did Sarah lower the pistol, her hand trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. Daniel quickly secured the other kidnapper, tying him to a tree where he could retrieve him later to face justice. Then he returned to Sarah, who stood in the center of the clearing, gently rocking Hope, who had quieted once more. Are you both all right? he asked urgently, checking them for any signs of injury. Sarah nodded, tears of relief filling her eyes. "We're unharmed. He surprised us at the cabin this morning, not long after you left. I was so afraid." Her voice broke. Daniel wrapped his arms around them both, holding them close as if he could shield them from all danger by will alone. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "when I came back and found you gone." "You found us," Sarah said, looking up at him with wonder. "You tracked us all this way." "I would have followed you to the ends of the earth," Daniel said simply, the words coming straight from his heart. Sarah's eyes widened at the declaration, and in the firelight he could see the moment she made a decision. Rising on her tiptoes, she pressed her lips to his in a kiss that conveyed everything words couldn't: gratitude, relief, and most of all, love. When they broke apart, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "Let's go home," he said softly. Sarah nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. "Home," she agreed. They gathered their belongings quickly and mounted Thunder, Sarah holding Hope securely as Daniel guided the horse back toward their cabin. As they rode through the night, stars brilliant overhead, Daniel knew with absolute certainty that his life had changed forever and for the better. The journey back to the cabin took most of the night, with frequent stops to rest the horse and tend to Hope's needs. They arrived as dawn broke over the mountains, the familiar sight of the cabin never more welcome. Daniel helped Sarah down from the horse, then took Hope while Sarah stretched her stiff muscles. The baby blinked up at him sleepily, then gave him one of her gummy smiles that never failed to melt his heart. "There's my brave girl," he murmured, kissing her forehead. "You and your mama are the strongest people I know." Inside, the cabin showed the signs of Blackwood's intrusion: the overturned furniture, the broken cups still on the floor. Daniel set Hope in her cradle while he and Sarah worked together to restore order, neither speaking much as the events of the past 24 hours caught up with them. When the cabin was tidy again, Sarah put a pot of coffee on the stove and sliced bread for a simple breakfast. They ate in companionable silence, both too exhausted for conversation, but drawing comfort from each other's presence. Finally, as they finished their meal, Sarah reached across the table to take Daniel's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for finding us, for saving us, for everything." Daniel squeezed her fingers gently. "I should be thanking you," he replied. "Before you and Hope came into my life, I was just existing, not really living. You've given me purpose, a reason to come home each day." Sarah's eyes filled with emotion. "When Victor took us, all I could think about was getting back to you, not just to the cabin, but to you, Daniel." The words he had been holding back since finding her in the clearing tumbled out. "I love you, Sarah. You and Hope both. I know it hasn't been that long and you might not be ready to hear it, but I love you too," she interrupted, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "I think I have for months now. I was just afraid to admit it, afraid of making another mistake." Daniel rose from his chair and moved around the table, kneeling beside her. "Loving someone is never a mistake," he said softly, "and if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Sarah's breath caught as she realized what he was saying. "Daniel," he took both her hands in his. "I don't have a ring yet, and this isn't how I plan to do this, but, Sarah Reynolds, will you marry me? Let me be a father to Hope, a husband to you. Let me love and protect you both for as long as I live." For one heart-stopping moment, she was silent, tears streaming down her face. Then she launched herself into his arms with such force that they nearly toppled over. "Yes," she whispered against his neck. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Daniel held her close, his own eyes damp with emotion. From her cradle, Hope gurgled happily, as if giving her approval to the arrangement. Later that day, after they had both rested, Daniel rode to town with the bound kidnapper Blackwood's hired man, Jenkins. He delivered him to the sheriff along with the full story of what had happened. Sheriff Wilson was sympathetic and assured Daniel that Blackwood would be wanted for kidnapping and attempted murder if he ever showed his face in Montana territory again. While in town, Daniel stopped at the general store and purchased a simple gold band, all he could afford, but given with all his heart. The shopkeeper's wife, upon hearing of his engagement, insisted on sending along a length of white ribbon and some dried flowers for Sarah's hair. When Daniel returned to the cabin, he found Sarah and Hope in the garden, enjoying the late afternoon sunshine. Sarah looked up at his approach, her face lighting with a smile that made his heart race. That evening, under the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, Daniel slipped the gold band onto Sarah's finger and renewed his promise to love and protect her and hope forever. Though it wasn't an official ceremony that would come later, when the circuit preacher next visited Riverspend in their hearts, they were already bound as family. As they stood together, hope nestled between them, Daniel thought of how close he had come to missing this life. If he hadn't decided to track that mountain lion, if he hadn't taken that particular trail through the woods, if Thunder hadn't sensed Sarah's presence. So many coincidences that had led to this perfect moment. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "That I'm the luckiest man alive," he answered truthfully. "And that some things are just meant to be." Sarah smiled up at him, love shining in her eyes. "Like us," she said softly. "Like us," he agreed and sealed the promise with a kiss. The official wedding took place 2 weeks later when Reverend Thomas made his monthly visit to Riverspend. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, eager to witness the union of the reclusive mountain man and the Eastern woman with the remarkable story of survival. Sarah wore a simple dress that she had sewn herself, with white ribbons in her copper gold hair and wildflowers in her hands. Hope, dressed in a tiny white gown that had once belonged to the blacksmith's daughter, was passed among the women of the town, all of whom had fallen in love with the cheerful infant. Daniel, in the one good shirt he owned, waited nervously at the front of the small church. When Sarah appeared at the doorway, his breath caught at the sight of her radiant smile. As she walked toward him, he knew with absolute certainty that this was the beginning of the life he was meant to live. The vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to love and cherish each other through whatever challenges life might bring. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the townspeople nearly lifted the roof. The celebration afterward was the liveliest Riverspend had seen in years. Tables groaned with food contributed by every family, fiddles played late into the evening, and even the most taciturn old-timers found themselves tapping their feet to the music. Sarah and Daniel, with Hope sleeping contentedly in her mother's arms despite the noise, slipped away as the stars began to appear. They rode back to their cabin, truly their home now in the peaceful darkness, hearts full of joy and hope for the future. 5 years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising to the Foster family. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family Hope, now a spirited 5-year-old with her mother's copper gold hair and her adoptive father's determined nature, had been joined by twin brothers, Matthew and Mark, who had their father's dark hair and their mother's blue eyes. Daniel had gradually shifted from trapping to ranching, building up a small but respectable herd of cattle that provided a steady income. Sarah, drawing on her training as a teacher, had begun instructing not only Hope but several neighboring children who would otherwise have gone without education. The wilderness around them was changing too. Riverspend had grown from a small outpost to a proper town with a school, a church, and even a small hotel. The railroad was rumored to be planning a line through the valley, bringing with it the promise of progress and prosperity. Through it all, Daniel and Sarah's love had only deepened. The trials they had faced together, harsh winters, illness, the occasional threat from nature or man, had strengthened their bond rather than weakening it. On a warm summer evening, much like the one when they had first acknowledged their feelings by the creek, they sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching Hope teach her 3-year-old brothers how to catch fireflies in the yard. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Sarah asked, her head resting comfortably on Daniel's shoulder. "If Victor hadn't abandoned me in the woods that night," Daniel considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at our children, at you, at everything we've built together, and I can't imagine any other path that would have led to this much happiness." Sarah smiled, turning to press a kiss to his cheek. "Nor can I. Even with all the danger and fear, I wouldn't change a thing if it meant losing what we have now." Hope ran up to them then, her small hands cupped carefully around something. "Look what I caught," she exclaimed, opening her fingers just enough to reveal the glowing insect inside. "Isn't it beautiful, beautiful indeed?" Daniel agreed, ruffling her hair affectionately. "Just like you, little one." Hope beamed at the praise, then released the firefly, watching it soar into the darkening sky. "I'm going to help the boys catch one now," she announced importantly, running back to where her brothers were spinning in circles, trying to follow the flickering lights. "She has your kind heart," Sarah observed, watching their daughter patiently showing the twins how to catch the insects without harming them. "And your courage," Daniel added. "She's the best of both of us." Sarah nestled closer against him as a cool evening breeze stirred the leaves. "Do you remember what you said to me that night in the woods, when you found me?" Daniel nodded, the memory still vivid after all these years. "I told you that you were safe." "I didn't believe you then," Sarah said softly. "I was too afraid, too hurt by what Victor had done. But you proved it true every day since." "And I always will," Daniel promised, wrapping his arm more securely around her shoulders. As darkness settled fully over the mountains and their children's laughter echoed across the yard, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance encounter in the wilderness to a life filled with love and purpose, their story was one of hope rising from despair, of light finding its way through darkness. What had begun with a pregnant stranger left for dead in the woods had become the greatest blessing of his life. And as Sarah turned her face up to his for a kiss, Daniel knew that some things truly were meant to be like finding your heart's home in the person you least expected, in the place you least imagined, at the moment when you both needed it most.